This century has seen a universal striving for human rights. Throughout the decades and across the world, ordinary people have taken to the streets to fight for their freedom. Political power no longer rests entirely in the hands of the elite. People demand a say in determining their own destiny. They have changed the unchangeable, questioned the unquestionable, moved the immovable. This has been a century of the people. In 1948, the United Nations attempted to define human rights and freedoms.
This Universal Declaration of Human Rights may well...
The Universal Declaration of Human Rights has become the great international charter of all people everywhere.
Everyone has the right to freedom of peaceful assembly and association.
In April 1989, 500,000 students and workers took to the streets of Beijing to protest at Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping's continuing hardline policies. The rallies were peaceful. They demanded greater democracy, freedom of speech, and an end to corruption within the Communist Party. They dramatized their demands by staging hunger strikes. The police were ordered to keep a low profile. The communist hierarchy looked on, reluctant to act during the state visit of Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. When he left, the Chinese leadership struck with an iron fist. The tanks rolled into Tiananmen Square. Unarmed students confronted the might of the People's Liberation Army. Pitched battles broke out. As the Western media looked on, the Chinese people's bid for freedom was brutally crushed. The People's Liberation Army fired indiscriminately. Thousands were wounded. 1,300 were killed. A lone student symbolized China's bid for freedom. The struggle for freedom has simmered beneath the surface in many communist states throughout the century. In 1968, Czechoslovakia experienced an exhilarating springtime of freedom when Alexander Dubček was appointed leader of the Communist Party. He embarked on a liberal reform program, ensuring freedom of speech and information. Moscow was deeply concerned. Emergency talks were held between Warsaw Pact leaders, but Dubček refused to forego his liberal reforms. The people of Czechoslovakia waited and hoped. In August, 750,000 Warsaw Pact troops marched in. The Prague Spring was over. The Czechoslovakian people argued with Soviet soldiers. The Kremlin claimed that the invasion was necessary to stop Dubček restoring capitalism. Press censorship was reimposed. the people pleaded with the troops to go home, to no avail. In Prague, 1 million mourners filed past the grave of Jan Palach. In a supreme act of defiance, the 21-year-old student had burnt himself to death in protest of the Soviet occupation. The struggle against Soviet oppression was nothing new. In 1956, after years of Stalin-imposed tyranny, Hungarian students and workers marched for freedom. As the momentum for freedom grew, the Soviet Union became increasingly agitated. On October the 25th, the hated Hungarian secret police opened fire on the protesters in Budapest. Hundreds died. Undeterred, the people fought back. The headquarters of the secret police was ransacked. On November the 1st, Prime Minister Imre Nagy announced Hungarian neutrality and withdrawal from the Warsaw Pact. Soviet intervention was inevitable. The Hungarian people were abandoned by the West. Their despair could be heard in their final radio broadcasts. Civilized peoples of the world, we implore you in the name of justice and freedom. Our ship is sinking. Light is failing. The shadows grow darker every hour over the soul of Hungary. Extend us your fraternal aid. Horrified by the brutal suppression of the Hungarian uprising, people of the free world demonstrated their anger. The United Nations voted to condemn the Soviet invasion.
Lebanon? Yes. Liberia? Yes. Libya? Yes. Soviet Union? No. United Kingdom? Yes. United States? Yes.
20,000 people were killed during the crushing of the uprising. 200,000 Hungarians went into exile.
Everyone has the right to seek and to enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution.
There are currently 23 million refugees in the world, displaced by the political and social upheavals of the 20th century. They exist in a political no man's land, where they enjoy few rights and almost no freedom.
Everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion.
Since 1959, the Dalai Lama, spiritual leader of the Tibetan people, has lived in exile. In 1950, the People's Liberation Army of China sent forces to invade Tibet. For almost a decade, the Dalai Lama tried to establish peaceful relations with the Chinese and protect the Buddhist faith. Following the brutal repression of a nationalist uprising in 1959, he fled to find refuge in India. Granted political asylum by Prime Minister Nehru, the Dalai Lama continued to campaign for the liberation of Tibet. He was determined to preserve the tradition of Tibetan Buddhism. The Dalai Lama was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1989. He remains in exile. China remains impervious to criticism of its treatment of Tibet. Since the Chinese occupation, Tibetan people have withstood the destruction of many features of their indigenous culture. The Chinese maintain that communism has freed the Tibetan people from a feudal theocracy. Despite the destruction of all but 10 of Tibet's 6,000 monasteries, the Buddhist faith remains strong. Revered among his people as a living Buddha, the Dalai Lama has become an international symbol of the struggle for freedom.
All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights.
For the surviving indigenous peoples of the world, repression arrived with the settlers, who soon became their masters. 300 million people live on the fringes of the modern world. In Australia, the Aborigines, once guardians of the entire continent, now control less than 1% of the land. Indigenous peoples find their way of life under constant threat from economic forces. The world's oldest surviving cultures must fight for their identity and their heritage. The bond between native people and their homeland is spiritual and ancestral, but their lives are hard. In northern Russia, the lifespan of the indigenous people is 18 years less than the national average. In the United States, the poorest county is the Oglala Sioux Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. Native people are forced to campaign against discrimination and dispossession. At the end of the century, it is indigenous people who are still fighting the last battle against colonialism. In Guatemala, the Mayan Indians make up 60% of the population, but they are ruled by a minority of Spanish descent. Their increasingly vociferous campaign for land rights has led to violent clashes with the Guatemalan military government. Thousands of Indians have disappeared in the last 30 years. Tens of thousands have been murdered. Nobel Prize winner Rigoberta Menchú has been campaigning for the rights of her people. Words are her chosen weapon in the fight for freedom and equality. Using the language of her oppressors, she has broken out of the linguistic isolation into which the Mayan Indians have retreated.
The land forms a major part of people's vision of the world. The land is a historic reminder, a source of culture, a source of life. It's the only thing that gives us a reason to live as indigenous people. No one shall be subjected to arbitrary arrest.
In 1989, Aung San Suu Kyi was placed under house arrest. She is the daughter of Aung San, who was the architect of Burmese independence. She has become a potent symbol of Burmese freedom. A military dictatorship had brutally suppressed any form of democracy movement in Burma. Aung San Suu Kyi was engulfed by this political maelstrom in 1988. Addressing pro-democracy rallies, she called for a non-violent struggle for human rights. These demonstrations and campaigns of civil disobedience repeatedly turned to bloodshed. Ten months after she was confined to house arrest, her National League for Democracy party won a landslide victory in the country's first democratic election for many years. The military junta simply ignored the result. The world's most famous political detainee was released from house arrest in 1995. She has yet to form her government. While she remains in Burma, she continues to cast a long shadow over Burma's military dictatorship.
With him, of course, is enormous patience. But by patience, I don't mean just sitting and waiting. I mean patience as strength, the strength to bear with adversity for as long as it is necessary to reach your goal.
Everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration, without distinction of any kind.
In the last 100 years, women have struggled for political emancipation in public life and equality in the workplace. Some have taken their place in powerful political dynasties. Others have overcome traditional taboos to seize the reins of power. Despite the fact that women make up over 50% of the population, they still constitute less than 10% of the highest echelons of government. Although 10% in high office is far from equality, women now do enjoy a level of emancipation hardly imagined by their grandmothers. The struggle for the right to vote has been a long one. Indeed, women in Switzerland didn't win the vote until 1971. For some, the cause was literally a matter of life and death. In 1913, the British suffragette Emily Davison threw herself under the King's horse at the Derby. She died a martyr to the cause. Across Europe and America, women formed associations to lobby for political and social equality. War and revolution provided the catalyst for change. As men went to war, the women made the weapons. After the Second World War, women entered the workforce in their millions. The cause became a fight for equal pay. Women launched themselves into realms traditionally reserved for men. In 1963, Soviet cosmonaut Valentina Tereshkova became the first woman in space. Women have been breaking records in aviation for decades. Amelia Earhart became the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic in 1932. Women have taken their place at the forefront of scientific research. From the armed services to the religious ministry, women are continuing their battle to be seen as equals.
Education shall promote understanding, tolerance, and friendship among racial groups.
In the United States, racial discrimination became a way of life for the Black American. Buses, churches, drinking fountains, hospitals and schools. Segregation was enshrined in law and enforced by terror. In 1954, the Supreme Court ruled that school segregation laws were unconstitutional. The decision caused outrage. It was the first significant victory for civil rights campaigners. In 1955, Rosa Parks refused to move to the back of the bus. This led to a 13-month bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama. The Montgomery bus boycott marked the beginning of Reverend Martin Luther King's involvement with the civil rights movement. On August 28, 1963, Martin Luther King led a march on Washington that brought civil rights to the forefront of American politics. By that afternoon, 200,000 black and white Americans had gathered at the foot of the Lincoln Memorial to hear Martin Luther King describe his vision of freedom.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream.
In 1964, the Civil Rights Bill was passed. Segregation in education was at last prohibited. The campaigning continued for the right to vote for all black people. In March 1965, a month of civil rights protests came to a climax when Martin Luther King led thousands of civil rights campaigners on a march from Selma to Montgomery.
What happened in Selma is part of a far larger movement which reaches into every section of America. Because it's not just Negroes, but really it's all of us. who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. And we shall overcome.
Despite winning the right to vote and promises of peace and justice, racial inequality has remained America's greatest social dilemma.
They're only compensating you for what they done to you in slavery. They're owe it to us. They're not giving us a damn thing. They're not giving us nothing. Brothers and sisters, they worked our forefathers in this country 310 years without a damn payday. They worked them 310 years without a payday. This is the reason that Rockefeller is rich.
Everyone has the right to take part in the government of his country, directly or through freely chosen representatives.
In 1952, Nelson Mandela established Africa's first black law firm, defending thousands of Africans charged under the nation's apartheid laws. After his imprisonment for treason in 1964, he became the symbol of black struggle for freedom. Apartheid guaranteed supremacy and affluence for the white minority. In 1960, 67 people died at Sharpeville, many shot in the back. A protest over the despised pass laws turned into a massacre.
There are many people who feel that it is useless and futile for us to continue talking peace and non-violence against a government whose reply is only savage attacks on an unarmed and defenseless people.
The murder of African youth leader Steve Biko exposed to the world the brutality of apartheid.
Destroy white South Africa and our influence, and this country will drift into faction strife, chaos, and poverty.
As international pressure mounted, South Africa's government began to remove some of the worst examples of petty apartheid. On February the 2nd, 1990, the new Prime Minister F.W. de Klerk removed the ban on the African National Congress. In Soweto, they celebrated, following de Klerk's announcement that Nelson Mandela was to be released. On February the 11th, 1990, after 27 years in jail, Nelson Mandela walked free. He was 71 years old. South Africa began a new era.
Take your guns, your knives, and your pangas, and throw them into the sea.
The violence continued. In 1990, 3,000 people died in clashes between the rival Zulu Inkatha and ANC movements. The white supremacists warned of a bloodbath as they marched through the streets of Pretoria. Their bigotry and hatred threatened to be insurmountable obstacles to freedom. But after 4 years of negotiations, black South Africans queued patiently to take part in the country's first free election. Nelson Mandela voted for the first time in his life. On May the 10th, 1994, he became President of South Africa. The dream of one man, one vote had been realized.
The will of the people shall be the basis of the authority of government.
Mohandas Gandhi inspired freedom movements around the world. India was the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. 5,000 British civil servants ruled over 300 million Indians. For the rulers, India provided a life of adventure and privileged luxury. Despite the wealth generated by India, the majority of her people lived in abject poverty. It was Gandhi who championed the cause of Indian freedom. Returning from South Africa a national hero, he was renamed Mahatma, Great Soul, by the people. At huge rallies, he argued that political freedom could only be attained through peaceful resistance. Satyagraha. The Second World War provided Gandhi with the opportunity to further his struggle for freedom. In 1942, he launched his Quit India campaign. He called for a peaceful mass movement of civil disobedience. When the British arrested him, violence broke out on the streets. As a country divided by religion, Indian independence was never going to be easy. Muhammad Ali Jinnah, leader of the Muslim League, called for an independent Muslim state, Pakistan. It would not be Gandhi, but his protege Nehru who would lead India to independence.
At the stroke of the midnight hour, when the world sleeps, India will awake to life and freedom.
August the 14th, 1947, the end of British rule. Lord Mountbatten, the last Viceroy of India, left behind a country irrevocably divided on religious grounds. In the exodus that followed, 200,000 people were massacred. 500,000 died from starvation, and 18 million became refugees caught on the wrong side of the India-Pakistan borders. Indian independence marked the beginning of the end of European empires. Colonial rule was replaced by self-government. Nations that had been ruled from afar for generations celebrated their independence. But the transition from colony to independent state was fraught. As Kenya celebrated the coronation of Britain's Queen Elizabeth II in 1953, the colony was being terrorized by a band of Kikuyu youth, the Mau Mau. Africa's first nationalist leader, Jomo Kenyatta, denounced the Mau Mau. He maintained independence could be won by peaceful means. But vilified by the white government, he was tried and imprisoned as a Mau Mau leader. Over-exaggerated reports that the Mau Mau were slaughtering thousands of whites caused panic amongst European settlers. In fact, only 32 Europeans were killed, compared to nearly 2,000 Africans. By 1957, 80,000 Kikuyu had been rounded up and herded into detention camps. Constitutional change was inevitable. In 1963, 2 years after being released from prison, Kenyatta led Kenya to independence. The winds of change were blowing through Africa. Self-rule became commonplace in Africa, but so did the legacy of colonial rule. In 1960, the Belgian Congo was granted independence almost overnight under the coalition leadership of Patrice Lumumba and Joseph Kasavubu. But the Congolese were ill-prepared for government. In 1959, there were only 137 Africans with secondary school education and 16 university graduates. Mutiny in the army began the chaos. Long resentful of their superiors, the troops locked up their officers and went on the rampage. In the resulting turmoil, Moise Tshombe declared independence for Katanga, the mineral-rich state in the south. As the country collapsed into civil war, Lumumba appealed to the United Nations for help. They dispatched a peacekeeping force, but the fighting dragged on. In September, Colonel Joseph Mobutu assumed power and ordered Lumumba's arrest. He was sent to Katanga in January 1961, where he was murdered. There followed 40 years of oppression and neglect under Mobutu's rule. Lumumba became a martyr to the cause of African independence.
Everyone has the right to form and to join trade unions for the protection of his interests.
In Poland, Lech Wałęsa, an unemployed shipyard electrician, became the figurehead of a fight for freedom that would ultimately defeat the might of Moscow. Wałęsa and the fledgling Solidarity movement led a strike protesting against rising food prices. "16,000 workers at the Lenin shipyard in Gdansk downed tools." After 2 months of tense negotiations, the communist government gave in to Solidarity's demands. Wałęsa signed an agreement that promised relaxation of censorship and the right to form independent trade unions. He became an increasingly prominent figure on the world stage. As Solidarity grew in importance, a new communist leader was appointed, General Jaruzelski. In 1981, a year after the strike, he imposed martial law. Solidarity was banned and its leaders arrested. Solidarity went underground. Books, magazines, and newspapers were printed and distributed in secret. The Catholic Church filled the space left by Solidarity. It became a sanctuary for its supporters. Solidarity's ideals lived on. International recognition came in 1983 when Wałęsa was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize.
Everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression.
The events in Poland were to herald a new era in Eastern Europe. In the USSR, the diehards of the old regime, Brezhnev, Andropov, Chernenko, all died within 4 years of each other. At 54, Mikhail Gorbachev was the first Soviet leader to have been born after the 1917 revolution. Under the banner of glasnost, censorship was relaxed. The authorities even stopped jamming Russian-language broadcasts by the West. Political prisoners like dissident physicist Andrei Sakharov were released. Perestroika, Gorbachev's economic reform program, exposed the real shortages and hardships being faced by the Soviet people. Unrest was mounting. The man fated by the West for bringing about the end of the Cold War faced increasing criticism at home. The Soviet people exercised their newfound freedom and protested at the slowness of change. As Gorbachev struggled to keep control at home, changes were sweeping the rest of Eastern Europe. In September 1989, the Hungarian government opened its borders to the West. East Germans took advantage. By October, 250,000 had fled to the West. For almost 30 years, the Berlin Wall had divided a city and a nation. The wall was a symbol of Soviet repression. Hundreds made a bid for freedom through the wire. The border guards had orders to shoot to kill. On November the 9th, 1989, the Berlin Wall came down, 28 years after it was built. As the German people celebrated, Romania was undergoing Eastern Europe's bloodiest revolution. Nicolae Ceausescu was one of communism's harshest rulers. His ever grander palace reflected his megalomania. The Romanian people were forbidden to talk to foreigners. All media was censored. Telephones bugged. Faxes and photocopiers banned. The murder of outspoken Protestant minister Laszlo Tőkés in December was the spark that ignited revolution. Ceausescu's intimidation could no longer constrain the anger of the Romanian people. As the crowds ransacked the headquarters of the Communist Party, Ceausescu and his wife Elena tried to flee the city by helicopter. They were caught and tried on charges of genocide. They were executed on Christmas Day. Gorbachev's reforms had initiated a second Russian Revolution and brought about the demise of the Communist Empire. As the old Soviet republics demanded freedom from Moscow, the world watched as the USSR disappeared. Across the Baltic states, 2 million people linked hands to form a 400-mile chain, a symbolic act that welcomed a new era of freedom. Huge freedoms have been won by the people of this century. Hopes have been fulfilled. Dreams have been realized. The fight for freedom has continued even in despair. Great individuals and great movements have inspired people to demand their human rights. Out of the darkness has always come a voice of hope.